Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending upon where you have joined from. Welcome to another webinar by Data Platform Geeks. Our webinar today is on the topic A Dialogue with Your Data Interactive AI with Azure Cognitive Services. And our speaker for today is Matt Gordon, who's a Data Platform MVP from USA. So thank you so much, Matt, for joining us once again with another webinar. So my name is Aarti Nambiar, and I'll be your host for the next few minutes, and Mamita Sinha will be helping with us with the moderation. So before we begin on the webinar, I wish all are keeping well and staying safe. So let me just walk through a couple of slides. We represent Data Platform Geeks and SQL Server Geeks, which are two different communities founded by Amit Bansal. So log into dataplatformgeeks.com where you'll find all the upcoming events, webinars, and you'll also get access to all the webinar recordings, resources, technical blogs, magazines, and many of you must be aware of that we are coming up with virtual symposiums in the month of May and June. We have already scheduled 4 virtual symposiums. You can all the details are available in dataplatformgeeks.com. And log into SQLServerGeeks.com where we have lots of activities, SQL Server related activities, and there are many free technical videos and blogs. So if you wish to join us or follow us in any of the social media channels, here's the link to it, bit.ly/DPG Social. We have our presence in LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Telegram. You can join us or follow us from your preferred social channel. And also you'll be staying updated and notified on all our activities. So once in a year, we come up with this international learning event called as Data Platform Summit, which usually happens in Bangalore, India. So Data Platform Summit, we have hosted the conference for the past 5 years. On the right side of the screen, you'll find the logos or themes for the previous years. So as of now, the Data Platform Summit 2020 dates have been put on hold due to the current pandemic across the globe. So once the situation is under control, we'll definitely reach you out with the dates. So this is the group picture taken at DPS 2019, which has happened in August in Bangalore. We had more than 1,000 attendees who had attended the conference from over 16 different countries and from 300 different companies. So there were more than 100 sessions based on 7 technology tracks, which were delivered by over 60 plus speakers from 20 different countries. If you're a person who works on data, AI, or analytics related technologies, this is a must attend summit for you all. So here at this learning event, you get to learn and network with the product makers, MVPs, Microsoft certified trainers, industry veterans, and your peers from different industries all over the world. So to know more about Data Platform Summit, you can log into www.dps10.com. I can even drop in a mail to contact@dps10.com. A special thanks to our DPG core team members who spend their time with the community apart from their schedules. We have Hamid Bansal, who is the founder and president, Manohar Punna, vice president, and other regional mentors from different cities. Apart from the DPG core team, we have the eDominer teams who help us in organizing and managing these events. Special thanks to Microsoft for supporting us with our community activities. Our knowledge partner for today's webinar is SQL Maestros. You can go ahead and visit sqlmaestros.com to know more about their offerings. You can also drop in an email to contact@sqlmaestros.com. SQL Maestros is also coming up with video courses on SQL Server performance tuning, T-SQL querying and programming. So I'll talk about more on SQL Maestros offerings by the end of the webinar. You're all members of Data Platform Geeks. Remain as a member and get notified on our activities. You'll get access to all the free videos, labs, magazines, and resources. Once in a year, we do put up. Once in a while, we do put up free hands-on labs for the community as well. So kindly whitelist DPG domain and add events at dataplatformgeeks.com to your address book so that you don't miss out on any of our updates. If you have joined today's webinar, if you have joined using the direct Zoom link, kindly go ahead and register yourself to Data Platform Geeks so that you'll get access to the recordings and webinar resources of the session. So beyond this webinar, if you have any questions, you can join our social channels and post your queries there. We'll definitely pass it on to the speaker. or someone else from the community will answer them. So without any much delay, let me hand it over to the speaker. Matt, over to you.
All right. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, Matt.
All right. Let me, all right, share my screen just a second here.
Your screen is visible, Matt.
Excellent. All right. We'll get going. Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah, hope you're all safe and well. Thanks for spending about an hour with me here. This is a really fun topic because normally data folks don't think that maybe AI ties into their normal day-to-day job. And certainly when I started getting into this stuff, it didn't tie into mine either. But I think you'll find as we walk through just a few things that we can do, some ways that this ties in not only our day-to-day job, but maybe interesting enough where it might pull us in directions that we didn't think we would go work-wise. So hopefully you find this interesting. Feel free to put questions in the chat throughout. I may take one break in the middle to handle those, and we'll handle some at the end as well. So here's a little bit about me. Feel free to reach out to me via any of these channels. I can be found online pretty much everywhere. SQL at Speed. My blog is sqlatspeed.com. And if you have any feedback for this session, feel free to email me that, or you can tweet it as well. What I like to say is if you think the session was great, tweet that. If you think it was really bad, email me, and don't tell anybody else. But really, any sort of feedback is good. And as we get back, hopefully, to in-person conferences towards the second half of this year, this is on the schedule for a few of those as well. So hopefully you enjoy it, and I look forward to any and all feedback you have. Here's a little bit more about me. And the one thing on here that I want to draw your attention to is the last line. I run the PASS local group in my hometown here in the States. And whether you're part of a PASS group or DPG or whatever, definitely stay involved in these types of things. Like I always say, the worst case is when you get involved with any sort of data community, anything, the worst case is that you're going to learn some stuff you didn't know. The best case, like what's happened to me over the past 7 years or so, is as you get more involved and you start volunteering, whether it's speaking or moderating or running events or anything like that, is not only do you make some good friends and learn some things you didn't know, but it can take your professional path in ways that you did not anticipate it going. For instance, I was able to speak at DPS last year. That never would have happened if I didn't start getting involved with local groups. And it was an experience that meant a lot to me. So the fact that you're here is great. Stay involved and see how you can help as well. As I noted, I am SQL at Speed everywhere online, and that's pretty much an excuse just to show this slide. Though we're not currently racing here in the States now, as most of the world is on lockdown. When this all blows over, I hope to get back to this. So if you think the talk wasn't that interesting, but you enjoy racing, I'm always happy to chat about that online as well. So I live here, so I'm coming to most of you from roughly 9,000 miles away. And forgive me if my voice is a little scratchy. It's about 5:40 a.m. here in the States. So without further ado, let's get into the actual talk. So here's what we're going to walk through. We're going to talk about what Azure Cognitive Services is. We're going to talk about what the language API is, and how that fits in kind of with the broader scheme. We have the possibility of 4 demos, generally with time limits. The automated content moderation one, I don't always get to that, but I do like to briefly mention it, even if I'm not able to show it. So we'll just see how we're doing on time. But you'll get to see at least those 4 things, and perhaps a couple bonuses as well. And we'll talk about this throughout. We'll end up with, what can we actually do with this stuff? I'd like to think some of the things that we're going to talk about and some of the things that I'm going to show you are really cool. But generally, we don't get paid just to do cool stuff. Our boss wants to know, well, what can this do for me? How can this help me? And so we're going to end up talking about that, and not just how much fun some of this stuff is. So what is Azure Cognitive Services? What it basically is a set of APIs. What Microsoft calls it, and you see it in quotes there, is that it's a set, or it's sets of ML algorithms to solve problems in the field of AI. That's vague, very vague. It's purposefully vague because I've been working with this stuff about 2.5 years, and it has evolved quite a bit. So they intentionally don't prescribe what it does and say, well, here's the things you can do. You can do these 6 things with it. You can do tons of things with it. And so they do kind of leave this vague. They just want us to understand that underneath basically everything we're going to talk about here is some sort of a machine learning model. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to understand how that works. There are certainly white papers available to us if we want to delve into that, but we need to understand that that kind of underpins everything we're going to do here. More importantly, how can we actually use this stuff? So it is basically that you can call with code of your own, and I'll show you some things that I've done. You can also call it with bots. So basically what these bots are, and I won't go heavily into bots, but we'll see one chat bot. These are ways to interact with these APIs where you're basically writing no code yourself. So it can be an excellent learning tool. And a lot of times maybe your experience with those may stop here, and we'll talk about some things, even if you're on this call and you're a DBA or something like that, which is certainly my background. There are ways that these can help you do your job better too. And you don't have to write a line of a language you don't know. You can just spin up a bot, and we'll talk about some ways to do that. Like I said, we can consume these via standard REST calls. So if you're on this call and you have any sort of an app dev background at all, that's a phrase that's going to be pretty familiar to you. And there are those no-code things like I talked about, like Azure Logic Apps, Azure Functions, Q&A Maker, which we'll see here in a few minutes, so on and so forth. So how do you learn to call these? One thing I don't want to do is spend an hour with us reading C# code, because that would be really boring. Thankfully, Microsoft's documentation on this is outstanding. They've done a really good job with it. There are lots of examples, lots of quick starts, and all this goes across multiple languages as well. So whether you're familiar with C# or Java or Python or something like that, you're going to find examples here. And I've got a link here in the slide deck, which I will upload after the session, that takes you right to their docs, which, like I said, contain everything from documentation on every API call, as well as tons and tons of examples for you to get started as well. So what are these? As you may have noted from the first slide, we're going to spend nearly all of this session talking about what the language API can do. But it's only one of 5 of these. So right now we've got Vision, which does what it says there. You can analyze images and videos and things like that, and you can extract information about them. it will also try to gauge if it's a face. It will try to gauge and score the emotion of that face. Is it angry? Is it happy? Is it frustrated? And it will try to attach some data to that to say, how angry is this person? How happy? Things like that. You can also compare different states. So say there's a streaming camera and it shows maybe a part of a river that may flood often. You can use the Vision API to understand what that section of river looks like when it's not flooded. And then you can also wire that up into an app to react if images start to come in from that feed that show flooding, then it can notify appropriate people and things like that. So Vision does a lot of cool stuff. It's really fun to play with, a little bit outside of the purview of what we're going to talk about here, but it's lots and lots of fun. Speech is pretty closely related to what I'm going to show you with language, and it does exactly what you think it can do: text to speech, speech to text. It also does some translation as well. So I'm going to show you the translation abilities within language, and I'll mention it when we get to that part as well. Speech is capable of the same things, just over audio, which doesn't necessarily translate into this particular venue well, so I don't show that. But it's important to understand that all the language stuff I show you, and when we start looking into what the results are that we get back after we make these calls, all of these kind of work the same way, and things are coming back to you structured in a pretty similar fashion. We also have decision and search, which the brief description I've got there is pretty accurate to what those are. Decision is kind of, I wouldn't say it's Bing exactly, but it's an enhanced search engine for academic papers and things like that, things that may not be uncovered by a traditional search engine. It can help you locate those things. As I said, what we're going to focus on for the next few minutes is the language API itself. And what's important to note is, like I said, these all kind of behave similarly. A lot of the calls look the same. A lot of the results you get back are pretty similar. And you can combine these with each other to do some different things. So just because I have an app that's calling the language API, if I decide I want to incorporate some speech in there and have an audio component as well, I can do that. So you can use all of these or just one of these. But language is where we're going to start, because I think it gives you a good background for what you can do with these things, how you can interact with them, and gives you some ideas for how to use them. And then you can start folding in, especially vision and speech as well. So before we get into kind of all of that, the one thing I want you to keep in the back of your mind is almost everything we do with these is JSON underneath, whether we're putting them in a logic app, whether the call happens there, or whether we're working in C# or anything like that. What you'll see is almost all of these are JSON documents. So there are ways to interact with these where you never have to understand that, but I think the better you understand kind of what the guts of these are, the easier of a time you'll have actually implementing and applying these. So what is the language API? Microsoft says it's this. It says it increases your app's ability to read, comprehend, and enrich written text. So again, fairly vague there, but actually a pretty good description of what it does. They've certainly added more and more to this as the years have gone on. So leaving that description vague actually kind of helps us understand what it's supposed to do. What do I say? So what this API and what all the APIs kind of underneath it do is they help us talk to people, whether it's users, customers, people who may be customers or users or things like that. It just helps us communicate with people in a more efficient way, and possibly in a language that they speak that we don't, which these days is more and more important as more and more businesses are, worldwide. Just talking to people in a single language is not very efficient and likely means you're missing out on possible consumers of your product as well. Is the language API just one thing? It's like, well, I'm just making this one call. Absolutely not. And you'll see there's a number of APIs underneath it. And we'll talk about just a handful, but all of these cognitive services APIs are kind of the same thing. There's a lot of stuff that's incorporated underneath there that does subsets of the overall functionality. And we'll see a few of those here in the next little bit. So what can I do with it? Let me first note that this is just kind of the highlights. These are kind of 5 things that you can do with this API that I think are interesting, that kind of match what the title of this is we're having a dialogue with our data. These 5 things help us do that. This is by no means a complete list of everything you can do with language. But I think these are interesting, and most of these kind of lend themselves to this kind of a session because they're fairly easy to show. You can kind of see, oh, this is what that does, and we're not forced to read a bunch of code to kind of understand what this is. There's a lot of interactivity there. So let's start with Immersive Reader. But before we do that, one thing I want to point out, and it's part of the reason I've got an asterisk there, is that Immersive Reader is actually in preview, where the rest of these are in GA. As I've worked with these over the last 2.5 years, don't let preview scare you. I have run a number of these as things came in and out of preview cycles. I've run a number of these for what I would consider production customers when they were still in preview. Microsoft seems very reluctant to move these or call them GA because they do evolve so fast. But go ahead and kind of embrace that. Just because it's in preview doesn't mean you shouldn't productionalize it, even if Microsoft may say, well, this, we wouldn't recommend putting this in prod. I've had good success with a lot of these services running at production levels, even though they were technically preview. So don't let that scare you off, but let's talk more about what Immersive Reader can do. So I really like the way that they describe what it does. So what the documentation says is it helps emerging readers, language learners, and people with learning differences absorb the written content on your site or in your app. So it kind of breaks those folks down into 3 groups. So what an emerging reader is likely a child who's starting to learn to read and figure out how sentences are constructed and things like that. Learners could be anybody of any age who may not speak a language natively, but they're starting to kind of move through that. And as part of that, not only are you learning vocabulary, but you're learning sentence structures and things like that. And the third group that this focuses on is people with learning differences. So somebody who may learn differently from the rest of us, or may have challenges particularly with language that most people don't have. And so that's the 3 groups they're kind of targeting with this. So what are some of the things that it can do? You can change the viewable size of the text. So if somebody maybe has struggles with vision and things like that, you can actually blow up the size of the text that they're reading to make it easier to read. And in coordination with some parts of the speech API here, you can actually, it will kind of follow along with them as somebody is reading. It will increase the size of the next bit of text. And there's actually a really cool quick start on their site that kind of shows how to do that. It can also display kind of like tooltips, where if you hover over a word, it will show you a picture of what that is, and that may make languages easier to learn, because maybe if you're just kind of trying to memorize what the words are, you don't always remember what the thing is that the word is. But if you're able to kind of hover a mouse over that and understand that that word is this thing, this can help you do that there as well. Where I talked about sentence structure and things like that, stuff that's important to learn as you learn a second language or a third or fourth. This can highlight nouns, verbs, and kind of all the objects in a sentence, so you start to understand that. It can, of course, as you might guess from the title, read the content out loud. It can break words down into syllables and things like that. And it can use the Translator API, which we'll talk about later, to translate all of this content into another language. So you could get something where this can kind of easily go back and forth between the user's native language and the one they're trying to learn, and that may help bring their language skills along as well. So not a live demo for this one, but I think this is kind of a good entry point to understand some very helpful things that this does, and also that it can work with some of the other APIs like Translator, like Speech, to do some very helpful things. But let's dive into some stuff that we can actually easily show here. So LUIS is the Language Understanding Intelligent Service. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, so we will stick with LUIS instead. So what does it do? Its first job, and we'll have a short demo after this slide, its first job is to determine the intent of the statement that is come into it. So we're going to talk in these next few slides and these next few minutes about a couple different ways to make a chatbot. And so if you're used to going to a website, whether it's a bank, whether it's a shop, anything like that, and you get that very helpful, cheerful person that pops up on the site and says, "We're always here to help. How can I help you?" No matter what time of the day it is. Odds are that's not a person, even though there's a picture of a person there. It's likely a chatbot, and it's probably powered, if they're using Microsoft tools, by either LUIS or Q&A Maker, which we'll discuss next. So LUIS starts out by determining what the intent of the statement is. So what is this person asking me? What are they telling me? And do I understand how to handle that? So it will determine the intent. It will try to isolate the entities described in the statement. So if it's a shop and you're asking about a certain item they have, it may try to pick that out and see if it has any responses tied to the entity that it pulls out. And this will make more sense when we kind of see what this does under the covers here in a minute. It returns a JSON object, as most of these do. Like I said, almost all of this is just JSON documents flying back and forth. One thing that's interesting about this is Microsoft has given us some pre-built models here for kind of particular types of shops and uses and things like that, but it allows you to create custom models as well. So for instance, where I live here in the States, there's a lot of horses around here, whether it's for racing or other type of events and things like that. Any sort of equestrian thing has language that's very unique to it. So typically any sort of a pre-built model you would get here is not going to understand a lot of the terminology of somebody who may be visiting an online shop for supplies for their horse that jumps or races or something like that. But if you owned one of those, you could create a custom model so it will understand jargon specific to that, where maybe the pre-built models don't. So LUIS is very flexible, and we'll talk about Q&A Maker here in a minute. And what you'll see is Q&A Maker is very standard, kind of out-of-the-box thing. It's useful, but it's not flexible. LUIS is kind of Q&A Maker on steroids. It's stronger, faster, and a lot more flexible with the things you can do with it. So how can we use this? We can call the APIs, just like everything else we're going to talk about here, or we can go to the Luis portal, which we're actually going to do now. And like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to toss those into the chat. So these are just some very basic demos that Microsoft provides on the site, but we'll kind of walk through these, and you'll start to understand the structure of the JSON document it gets back, and what Luis is doing, and then how it kind of tries to respond to these. So, for instance, we'll click on book me a flight to Cairo. So it sees right here that, okay, this is what the user has asked me to do, and then it tries to determine the intent of that. So behind the scenes in Luis itself, you're giving it what intents are and how to respond to those. So in this particular example, there's an intent that's book flight. So probably this knows, oh yes, this is going to go on an airline site. And so we've built an intent that odds are people are going to come to my site, say, I would like to book a flight to go somewhere. So it scores this phrase and says, well, it says book, it says flight, odds are this is the intent that we need. And I'm almost 99% confident that that's what I'm going to do. So that's what it calls the top scoring intent. What you'll see down here is the intents that it worked through to kind of arrive at that. Now it doesn't do it in kind of a sequence, it's all concurrent happenings. But it looked at book flight, it looked at none. Basically, I don't know what this is. There's nothing in my knowledge base to tell me this. And it also looked at location finder, reminder, food order, and it was pretty sure it was none of those. So it, again, we've got our top score here, almost 99% confident. So what are the entities here? So, well, where am I booking my flight to? It knows that Cairo is an entity, and we'll talk in a few slides about how some of these APIs work together to determine things like this. It knows that it's a location, it shows where it is in the sentence and things like that. And then what would happen from here is there would be a response. And in the next slide, we'll kind of see how the chatbot responses work. But what I want to set the foundation of here is when you're talking to Luis or Q&A Maker or similar things, what do they see and kind of how do they parse through it? So we'll do one more here. So this says order me 2 pizzas. So I've gone to the site of my local pizza shop, and I say this phrase to its bot, and it says, aha, this is a food order. I'm very confident, even though, of course, it's worked. So I'm definitely not booking a flight. It says pizza, it says order. And not only does it understand that pizzas is a food type, which again is something you're going to establish behind the scenes, which will this should make more sense on the next slide. It's understanding that you're referring to the entity of pizzas, and you're actually referring to 2 of them. And then, so it's going to return this, and then the conversation starts from there. So back to our slides. So that's Luis. It's that's a very basic understanding of what it is. Like I said, it's very powerful. It's very flexible. It understands context well. If you're not familiar with this term, what it's doing is using natural language processing to both understand what you're sending it and talk back to you in a useful, somewhat natural way. So let's actually see something like this in action. Q&A Maker, like I said, is more of kind of an out-of-the-box version of Luis, I'd say. Under the covers, they work similarly, but where Luis is very flexible, Q&A Maker is less so. So what can you do with it? You're basically serving up information interactively. So if you could bring like a frequently asked questions page to life, Q&A Maker is designed for that need. It drives off what Microsoft calls knowledge bases, and I'll show you one of those here after this slide. Knowledge bases can actually be websites. So let's say you work at a company and you have a number of FAQ pages for a product or service or something like that, you can actually point Q&A Maker at those. So when somebody arrives at your site, instead of searching around and trying to find the answer, they can actually have a conversation with a bot. And it will answer based on what's in its knowledge base, which can be a website, can be a CSV file, can be a TSV file, things like that. As I've mentioned, it's similar to Luis, but it's a fixed offering. So it has, even though there's natural language processing going on underneath, it has a lot less of an understanding of context. But it's also, I think, a good bit easier to build as well. So what I'd like to do is kind of show you how one of these looks and how it works. And then, that's kind of the entry point into these. And if you find Q&A Maker really restrictive, then Luis operates similarly, but you have a lot more you have to set up to actually show it off. So without further ado, let's get into the demo of Q&A Maker. So what I've done here is I've kind of pre-built a lot of these. So what you'll do, and I have resource links on the last slide, but if you go to qandamaker.ai, you sign in, you would use your Azure credentials to do so. And one thing I do want to note is a lot of what I'm showing you here, there are free tiers. Now you're limited sometimes with the number of calls you can make and things like that, but everything I'm showing you here, you can go and play with for, if it's not free, maybe $1 or $2. So it's very inexpensive to kind of jump in and learn. They want to make this easy. They want to get you used to working with it. And then obviously they hope you put that in some sort of live thing, and then you're spending a lot of money, but they make it easy to kind of get in and understand and spend little to no money. So what this knowledge base is as I noted, I like racing, I like fast cars, and let's say that maybe my wife was looking around online and wanted to buy me a gift and thought a really cool gift would be a day at a racetrack. And there's and you see these services kind of all over the world, where usually in large cities, if there's a racetrack nearby, you can spend however much money it is, and you can have the use of a really fast car for an hour or two, generally with a driving instructor and things like that. So let's just say that she was looking for a gift and that I was going to be in Miami for work. And she's like, oh, well, this would be a perfect time to find a gift. So I will find a place in Miami that does this sort of service. So let's say that this company had a chatbot set up. They don't, but they had a really cool website. So I used their FAQ page and I pointed my Q&A Maker bot at this, and there's the URL right there. So if I pop over to this is a pretty standard FAQ page, right? How do I have to be to drive? Is there a speed limit? Can I drive my own car? Things like that. So let's actually talk to this and let's see this in action. So here's my knowledge base here, and you can see basically question, answer. So these come in pairs. You can add alternative phrasing. So where I said Luis is generally pretty flexible and built to understand and kind of derive the intent of what the person's asking, Q&A Maker, and you'll see this here in a minute, is pretty fixed. It's going to reliably respond to questions that are very similar to what it says here. If you want to add alternative phrasing, maybe some other ways that people might say that, you can do that here. Otherwise, its understanding is kind of limited to something that hews pretty close to what the actual text is. So let's talk to this. So our knowledge base is here. Our bot is here. So you'll know this is something I've built in Azure. It was originally built for SQL Saturday Cleveland this year, thus the name. And one thing I can do for my Q&A bot is you've got test and web chat here. So this means you don't have to deploy it. You don't have to incorporate it into a website that we'll talk about here in a minute, how you would do that. You can just test it and talk to it here. So, all right, so we'll start over. This will spin up. and we'll ask it, since I like to drive fast, what is the speed limit? And it answers back, no speed limit, which is what we would expect it to say, because it's right there. And I asked a pretty similar question, but where I talked about its sense of context isn't very good. So I'm going to ask the same question in a different way. How fast can I go? It doesn't know. And so for human, if I came up to you and you worked at this place and I said, what's the speed limit? You'd say, well, there isn't one. And then I ask you, how fast can I go? You would think, I just told you that. There's no speed limit. Q&A Maker, because it doesn't understand the relationship between fast and speed, where something constructed in Luis likely will, because you would build that in there. And it's just a little smarter and more flexible under the covers. This isn't. But it is pretty cool. We can ask it things like, how many guests can I bring? Yeah. And so, what we've got here is kind of an easy way to supply customers information, or potential customers. Like I said, maybe my wife is shopping for some sort of a gift for me and thought that I would think this was cool. And I don't have to go search a site to do that. And like I noted, though I pointed that directly at a URL, you don't have to. You can upload CSV file, TSV file, things like that, and just questions and answers, and have a very friendly chatbot answering those for you. One thing I do want to show you is, so this is cool, but obviously just directing somebody to the Azure portal to talk to this thing is not useful. We want it on a website. So how would we do that? And I'll go ahead and show you this. We'll go over here. So what we've got, and you'll see this the last demo where I wrap up, these APIs all have secret keys. Obviously, this is X'd out. If you incorporate these in your code, that means somebody can go in and look at this key, and they'll know the URL of the Cognitive Service API as well, and then they can use your service and you'll get billed for it. So it's important to keep these secure. But what I actually want to draw your attention to is this. I am by no means a web designer at all. That is not where my skills lie. However, I do know what an iframe is. And this is all it takes to incorporate one of these bots once you've published it into a website. It's an iframe, so it's just going to be a portion of whatever page, and that's it. Very straightforward. So you don't have to be a web designer at all to put one of these in the site, and then you'll get an interface fairly similar to what I've just shown you here. So not only are these easy to spin up, they're easy to put in a site as well. And when I originally built this demo for this session back a few months ago, no joke, it took me less than 10 minutes from start to finish. So it's very, very cool stuff. And, for those of you who may be coming from a DBA background or something like that, one of my favorite uses for this is there's certainly jobs that I've had over the years where most of the questions that I end up being asked is, what is the environment? Where does this server live? Or this client, where's their QA environment? Or what's the name of the database server, for their production or something like that. You could build a Q&A maker pretty easily to answer all those questions for somebody. So when somebody sends you an email or Skype or a Teams chat, it says, hey, for client XYZ, what's their prod server and what's their test server and what's dev? That can take up a lot of your day just answering stuff like that. You can build a Q&A maker chatbot to answer all that for them. Just say, go ask this, it knows. And you could have uploaded all that information in a CSV file, and it will kind of do the rest for you from there. So hopefully you found that useful. Now we're going to dive into what I would say is kind of one of the more fully featured APIs underneath the language API, and that's text analytics. So what can I do with it? The next demo we're going to do actually wraps up on the final point here, is talking about sentiment analysis of pieces of text. In this case, it'll be tweets. And that's kind of what everybody shows, like text analytics, sentiment analysis is kind of what where everybody's brain goes. But I want to highlight a few other things that this API can do as well that are potentially useful. So it can do key phrase extraction. What is that? It's exactly what it sounds like. So it returns key phrases from sections of text. So for instance, if you go to a blog or site and you see those word clouds, something like this is likely powering that. And where key phrase extraction can be useful is, let's say you work at a software company or any sort of public facing place, and you have like a support forum or a community forum or something like that. And you've rolled out a new product or a new version or something like that, and you want to quickly ascertain how your customers are reacting to that. Something like running key phrase extraction on all posts can give you exactly that, where if the phrase that it's extracting is really bad, that's not good. That means people are upset with whatever the new version is. But if it's pulling out phrases like, I love this, this is wonderful, then you're having, obviously a customers that are pretty happy with what you've done. So that's one thing that it can do. As it notes, and you'll see this in the docs as well, it works better on unstructured text. And so that's a lot of the demos of this stuff you'll see relies on like message board posts or social media and things like that, because a lot of this stuff does work a little better on unstructured text than kind of pre-prep sections of books and things like that. Text analytics can do language detection as well. We'll see that in a demo here at the end. That obviously goes hand in hand with the Translator API as well. You can make some very flexible translation apps where not only can it detect what comes in, but it can then translate that into a variety of languages on the way back out. We can also do named entity recognition here as well. So what is that? So what that is it identifies and classifies different entities in text. And so if you go to a site and you see where maybe you run your mouse over a place or an object or something like that, and you'll get tooltips that come up that may be a link to further description of that or something like that, this is powering something like that. So named entity, it will pull out people, places, currencies, date ranges, things like that. And then you can drive an action off that. Like maybe it will highlight every date range in there. And then if you click on that, it takes you to a link for your local calendar app to make some sort of an event for those dates. Entity linking kind of goes hand in hand with that. And what the documentation says it does is identifies and disambiguates the identity of an entity found in text. So what does that really mean? It's using the context of the sentence itself to determine what you're talking about. For instance, Venus is a planet and was also the Roman goddess of love. This will see the word Venus in a sentence and use those context clues around it to direct you to more information about what it thinks that is. Now, one thing I think that's kind of interesting about this is that the knowledge base that it uses to understand all of this is actually Wikipedia. So there are ways to customize that and direct these links elsewhere, but it's actually using a non-Microsoft product to do this, which I think is pretty interesting. Finally, sentiment analysis. So let's talk more about what that is, and I'll kind of show you how that works, and then we'll get into our last 15 minutes or so. Okay, so let me show you how a sentiment analysis works with Azure Logic Apps. So if you're not familiar with Logic Apps, and let me get signed out here. If you're not familiar with Logic Apps, what these are, basically workflow containers. And this is not container. So if you're coming to this from a DBA or strong data background, it's not containers in the way that we're hearing about now. When I say they're workflow containers, they're really actually that. They're kind of a stateless app that spins up and contains a workflow, which we'll see if I click on the right thing here. So this kind of looks like an SSIS package, right? So they all drive off some sort of event. So you connect your Logic app to a system, whether it's social media, like I've done here, something like ServiceNow, something like SAP. There's almost 300 connectors that Microsoft's done first party to different things. So it's basically event-driven workflows, and this app spins up, does this work, and then goes away. And so it's handling all the scaling and everything behind the scenes. You'll see these called serverless. It's technically not true. It's running on a server somewhere, but we're not managing any of that. We're just saying, hey, when this thing happens, do this list of things. So let me briefly kind of walk through what this looks like. So for sentiment analysis from tweets, I created a Logic app so this was actually for a football podcast here in the States. And they wanted to understand, it's kind of a comedy podcast. They do talk about football somewhat seriously, but in a very non-serious way. They kind of reached out to their audience and wanted to know, in a particular year, I think, where Manchester City had started winning, I think they had won the first 12 matches of the season. The guys who host this podcast had said the season was ruined, that they joked and said they were going to quit doing the podcast because there's no point in talking about anything because the season's over. The only thing that really mattered is if they could get a table ranking the supporters' feelings. And I happen to know how to do that. And so this is actually part of what I built for them. So since I support Spurs, it looked for that. And what this did is these, once they're active, it would use the Twitter search API, and it would pull, in this case, every 1 minute, say, are there tweets that have the phrase Spurs official, which is Tottenham's handle? Once it found one, I would push that tweet, that text, to the detect sentiment action. And you just add those here where you can insert a new step. So I added a new step, spun up a Cognitive Services resource within Azure. And then, as you'll see here, this is all, I didn't have to write a line of code to do this. I just said, I want to score the text of this tweet. So I want to understand, is this a happy tweet? Is this a sad tweet? And I wanted English language tweets. And then what did I want to do with that? So I've gone to the Twitter search API under the covers here. Again, haven't written a line of code to do this. I've then pulled the text of that tweet, as you can see there, and told Cognitive Services, said, give me a score of the positive or negative value of this tweet, 0 being negative, 1 being positive. And then what do I do with it? So down here, I use an insert row action connecting to an Azure SQL database, and I store all of this stuff, the username of the person that tweeted, the text itself, description, location, the sentiment score, which comes from the previous step. And again, this was just all clicks and drags, not a line of code to do this. On the back side of it, what does the data come out looking like? So I have an example of some good tweets and some bad tweets. And this was actually for a football club here in the States that I did some work with. If you follow top flight football here in the US, you'll know who this is. If not, that's okay. And I will apologize in advance. This is raw data from several match days of theirs. There may be some unfortunate language in here. They were not very good that season. So if you see any unfortunate language, my apologies. But let me kind of highlight to you what this came out looking like. So we've got the username of the person that tweeted here. She seemed to be very happy. This was my first soccer pro game. I enjoyed it so much. And we scroll over, that sounds pretty positive, right? We go over there, it is. So we've got a sentiment score of 0.9899. That means that sentiment analysis has determined this is about as positive as it can get, and it certainly is. So what does a bad one look like? I don't like this club anymore. This person is not very happy with them. You'll see this was from a match that they were pretty bad. And so we scroll over and we would assume that's going to be pretty negative, and it is 0.0014. So what sentiment analysis does is you get it scores that text. So it's scoring the content of the tweet here, and then it's putting a number on it. Now, version 3 of this API actually does some more interesting stuff than this, where it will actually score sections. So for a tweet, this wouldn't be very useful, but if you're trying to score like a blog post or something like that, it will tell you when it goes from positive to negative and neutral. And so you can still get the numeric score like you've got here, but it will also say, well, it starts out very positive and the first 32% is positive, and then it's moderate, and then it's negative at the end. So there's some different ways to kind of view that as well. But it still does exactly what I just showed you here, which is a lot of what people use the language API and text analytics underneath it for. So where we're going to kind of wrap this up here is talk about the Translator API. So what this does generally is it translates text using neural machine translation, what's known as NMT. That this is considered to be the more, let's say, modern way to do this. So it's using a neural network to do it. You don't have to understand how one of those works. I certainly have computer science teachers that I had that would argue that I don't understand how those work based on my grades. So you don't have to understand any of this, but it's what's good to understand is nearly all of the translations here are using NMT, which is not only faster, but it's considered to be much more accurate. What you'll see if you go to the documentation page for the Translator API is there are a few that's using what's called SMT to translate, and that is statistical machine translation, which is not as intelligent, also takes longer. You'll still get a translation, and you're probably not going to notice the performance difference for most of what you're doing, but the languages that use NMT, you're going to get more accurate translations out of these. So Translator obviously can translate text. We kind of could have guessed that by the name. What it can also do, and what I think is fascinating, is it can transliterate text. So say we're going from a language with one alphabet into a language of a different alphabet. The call that I'm basically going to show you here in a couple minutes, you can convert from alphabet to alphabet here. So that kind of opens up, you're not just translating from kind of one related language to another, you can translate from just about any major language in the world to just about any other one. And you can do this also in coordination with the speech API as well. And you can translate it. Wouldn't really go over here because this is a webinar, but you can actually get audio of this, and you can have a speaker speak in their native language and have the API respond in a different language. Pretty fascinating. You can also detect the language. So if you're ingesting a lot of text content and kind of trying to sort out, this is English, this is Spanish, this is Hindi, this is German, whatever, it can kind of sort those into buckets for you. You can also look up word translations as well. Like I said, Translator Text is only for text, but the speech service does a lot of this under the covers. And actually, when I give this session in a conference venue, in the introduction, I kind of handle speech and kind of show off what it can do here as well. But speech really deserves its own session. It does a lot of cool stuff. And it does it in a very similar way to what I'm going to show you here. So, Translator app. What I've done here is I've written some C#. And it's fairly basic. And what it does is it takes a text string and it translates that into the languages that I specify here. So let's go ahead and run this. Again, it's a console app. Like I said, my gifts do not lie in web design. I don't make pretty applications either. But let's go ahead and run this and see what it does, and then we'll kind of walk through what that means, and then we'll wrap up with some of the ways we can apply this, and that's it. So I will say, what would I like to translate? Thank you for attending my session. And so this is translated to English, so it knows, so this is the language detection I talked about. It knows that it's English. It's very confident in that. 1 basically means 1.0. It's like, I know this is it. That's not a translation. That's actually what I said. This is translated to Italian, to French, and to what the documentation says is Klingon as well. So if you're a fan of Star Trek, you'll get a kick out of that. If not, you'll have no idea why that's there. And that's it. So I've typed one thing. I've translated it into 4 languages very simply. So how does this actually work? So I'm not going to go through line by line because that would be really boring. But what I've got here is this is basically the URL of the API itself. And again, when you provision one of these in Azure, I don't show that because it's very dry, but it will provide you not only URLs to call, but you'll also generate secret keys, which basically your password to use it. Like I said, safeguarding these in environment variables like I did here, pretty important. Otherwise, somebody could get the code of your app, see your key, and then call your API and spend a bunch of your money doing that. So what I've got here is I have basically what's called the route, but we're calling the translate API. This is just a normal REST call. And here are the languages that I want it to translate to. And on the Cognitive Services documentation page, you have these 2 or 3 letter codes for English, Italian, French, Hindi, Klingon, all those sorts of things. Simple then here it says type the phrase that you'd like to translate. It uses a read line to pull that in. And then there's a method here, translate text request, pulls in the key. The endpoint I'm supposed to use, the route, which is basically the end of the call, so it knows what languages to translate, and then the text I want to translate as well. And that's almost it. But what I want to call your attention to down here is this. So this is where it writes out, it says, I think this is English, what's the score? And then it kind of outputs language translations, all that. But what does this result set look like? So I've mentioned over and over again that under the covers, this is JSON. There it is. So you can kind of see where my mouse arrow is here. This is the actual JSON result that comes back. So obviously, if you were making this as a real app, you wouldn't want to show anybody this. But since we're here learning, I want to show you what comes back. So it's pretty simple. So we've got a list of translations, which is what you see here. And then we've got a line of code over here that deserializes the JSON object that comes back. And what that means is basically it's kind of pulling those out of order and making them their own thing. And so we can output this in a clean way instead of just spitting this back out to a prompt. We get kind of this nice friendly thing down here. Any cognitive services call you make is going to look like this. And any result you get back across any of these APIs is generally going to look a lot like this. It's not scary. I'm by no means a C# dev at all, but this, again, was fairly easy to put together from some of the Microsoft quick starts. I kind of put my own spin on it. And I think this is a great way to kind of wrap up the technical portion of this. And so we understand none of this stuff's scary. It does really cool stuff, and we don't necessarily have to understand how it does all the cool stuff, but interacting with it is pretty straightforward. I mean, this is an app that's basically 85 lines of code. So let's wrap up with a couple minutes of how we can actually use this, and then that's it. So if you do have questions about the bonus demo, by the way, I'm happy to handle those offline. You can send me an email and I can send you how to walk this through. What automated content moderation is it uses some elements of the language API to step in to moderate, like a support forum or something like that, to make sure there's not indecent terms on there, bad language, things like that. Happy to kind of show you that offline. That's really in here for when this session is delivered at 75 minutes. So what can companies do with this stuff? For Immersive Reader, we talked about what that is, but what they can really do is it makes your online presence friendlier to customers who may have learning challenges that not everybody has. So it's, it makes your online presence much more inclusive than it otherwise would have been, and so that can be a nice thing depending on what your company does and what the customer base might be. You can make your online presence very friendly. Luis, we talked a lot about what that does. It lets us build a conversational model for, in general, like public-facing customer interaction, but can also be used for a lot of internal things as well. So for your internal help desk, if they're handling a lot of things like password resets and things like that, you could build a Luis kind of chatbot out to handle a lot of that and not need a person to do it. You could also then fold the translator API into that and do that across multiple languages as well. Q&A Maker, we showed that, allows us to build a chatbot quickly without any code. You'll note everything I showed you there was not a line of code that powered that at all. Where I find this helpful with my kind of DBA and data consulting background is for internal support desks. This can be really useful. Like I said, if you get a lot of questions about what environment lives where and this server name, what does it have on it and who owns it and stuff like that, you can build a CSV file of all of that information, upload that as a knowledge base to Q&A Maker, and then somebody can just go talk to the bot to find all of that out. Text analytics. We talked about, with new software releases, new versions of things, you can kind of analyze what people think about it. You can also do something, and unfortunately we have this problem here in the States where we have a lot of gun violence and things like that. And oftentimes it kind of follows a pattern that we get used to seeing where somebody oftentimes was making a string of negative social media posts and things like that. And whether it's a student or an adult, usually the authorities kind of had an inkling that that was going to happen. They're on some sort of a watch list and things like that. You can use sentiment analysis for that and kind of get a baseline of what their social media feed from a sentiment standpoint. What is that score? Let's say it's 0.5. If it starts to take a downturn, you can then use something like a logic app I showed you or things like that to trigger off an event, that score dropping, and then notify the appropriate authorities to do a wellness check on the person or something like that. That's just one application of many, but there are school districts here in the States that actually use this technology for that now. Translator, kind of obvious what it can do, but what that allows us to do is have a user speak to us in their language, and either we can pass that content on internally in our native language, or we can respond in a different language depending on what those needs are. If you've ever been involved in software doing any sort of a localization effort at all, Translator Text is a game changer for that, because no longer do you have to find resources that speak the language that you're trying to localize to. You can do this across, I think it's 80 some languages that Microsoft supports, and you don't need to hire a resource to do it. You can do it programmatically. So I hope you found that useful. Again, these are all the ways to contact. Happy to chat about it in any venue. The resource page is here actually on the last slide, and it's kind of everything that I showed you. And this is linked to quick starts, documentation, things like that. But with that, I'm through, and happy to take a couple minutes for questions if you'd like.
So thanks, Matt. That was a wonderful webinar, and I hope the audience loved it. So before we take up the Q&A, let me just have a couple of slides from our knowledge partners, Ecole Maestros. Meanwhile, I request all the attendees to post your questions in the Q&A panel. Please do not post them in the chat window, post them in the Q&A panel. So if there are any more questions beyond the webinar, you can always post them in our social channels. The link is given in the chat window, bit.ly/dpg social, where you have access to all the social channels. So you can post them. We'll definitely reach it out to the speaker, or anyone from the community will definitely respond. So a word from the knowledge partner, SQL Maestros. As I talked about the SQLmaestros.com, you can visit the website and learn about more about the video courses on performance tuning, T-SQL querying, and T-SQL programming. Coincidentally, today one of our courses has gone live, and there are other courses which will be launched soon. So video courses can be watched at the convenience of your home or work. These are high quality HD professionally recorded videos, which you can watch anytime, anywhere, and as many times as you want. So there are full length courses available as well as the individual modules. You can visit our website sqlmaestros.com, or drop in a mail to contact@sqlmaestros.com. So SQL Maestros has another offering called as Hands-on Labs. We believe that practice makes an individual perfect, and on this we have Hands-on Labs, a document-based learning where you'll be provided with step-by-step instructions, observations, screenshots, and scripts. So by the end of each document or lab, you'll be an expert in that particular lab. Right now, we have more than 100 labs on technologies related to SQL Server, Azure, Power BI, Analytics, Cosmos DB, etc. So the good thing about the hands-on labs, and the reason community loves it, is its subscription model. Once you purchase them, you can own it for life, and keep it with you. So go ahead and visit sqlmaestros.com. There are a couple of free hands-on labs available. You can download them and practice on it. So the links are again given in the chat window. So well, with this, thank you so much for your time, and now let's go on to the Q&A. Matt, you can just check the Q&A panel. There's a question, I guess.
Yeah. So I basically what it was is somebody who attended created a custom entity model in Luis, and they're running into a problem. There's a standard character limit of 500, but in their particular use, they need to send it kind of long, unstructured text, and were asking me kind of a workaround for that. That's probably a question that goes into a depth that we shouldn't handle here, but I've asked them to email me offline, and I'll kind of talk about what those workarounds might be. And I think that's the only one that I see.
I guess there are no more questions.
Yeah.
We have posted a thank you note for Matt on our LinkedIn and Facebook pages. The link is available in chat window. I request you all to kindly visit and leave us a feedback or comment, which will definitely encourage our speakers to come back and deliver sessions. So if there are no more questions, I wish you all the best, and see you all in the next webinar on 16th of April. And of course, do not forget to register for the virtual symposiums. The first virtual symposium is on SQL Server starting on May 7th. So you can visit dataplatformgeeks.com and book your seat for the event you wish to attend. Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for the wonderful webinar and for your time.
Thank you.